Say a word with me. Just one word. 2 letters, 1 syllable, and yet the most load-bearing word in the history of the human species. Us. From the smallest quarrel to the largest mass atrocity in modern history, there was a sentence that begins with the word we. We must protect ourselves. We are under threat. We are not like them. Or maybe us. Join us to save the nation. Help us destroy the enemy. They are coming for us. Us is the word that built the first villages. It's the word that filled the first churches and lit the pyres around them. It is the word that shaped strangers into armies and then armies into nation. It's the word carved above every gate of every empire that ever called itself civilized. It's the word whispered in the back rooms of every revolution, and they decide whether one person belongs to the revolutionary movement or not. Moreover, though, us is the word that starts conflicts and wars and determines in the aftermath, whether that be colonialism or anything other than that, what happens to the people involved. When we are to define who we are, everyone thinks the answer to that is self-evident. For example, I am Choi. I'm South Korean. I belong to a South Korean family, but I also go to Westminster School. Whether it be a nation or a shared identity or political ideologies, we think that this whole categorization is neutral. But that is not the case. This process of self-categorization is not only a process of selection into which group you actually belong to, but it's also one of identification. Therefore, constructing a collective identity at the same time does unite, but also excludes. As Wittgenstein states, we see we, or us, as an innocuous element of the English literature. It's a simple pronoun. It's 2 letters. It's used every day in our essays. It's a grammatical convenience that just denotes a certain group or a community. It's nothing that big. But as Wittgenstein states, the limits of my language are the limits of my world, meaning the limits of the language is inseparable from the limits of the world. And in this case, us becomes something not only descriptive, but generative. And repeatedly using us as a word constructs a certain boundary. And this boundary between the us versus the them, who are not included in the us, acquires a tendency towards permanence. And this boundary permanently embeds itself into the roots of society. This is further supported by Benedict Anderson's Imagined Communities, where he states that nations are formed through shared narratives that produce a sense of collective belonging amongst individuals who will never, ever meet. And this is the very mechanism that produces cohesion and also produces exclusion. Because to imagine a community, as it states in the title, you need to define its limits. And to define its limits, we need to know who exactly belongs and who exactly does not. This is further proven by the ideological square of Van Dyck, where there is an in-group positive and an out-group negative. When I think about a person who belongs to my own community, let's say people in South Korea, he says that our violence is seen to be defensive, our grief is to be seen as a tragedy, and our culture is rich. However, on the other side of the opposition, their violence is aggressive, their grief is invisible, and their culture is primitive. So this proves the bias that we have between the us versus them, the communities that we belong to, and the differences. This is very well illustrated not only through wars, because there are already 2 sides, but also for colonialism. So we want to view this as a linguistic project and not a history lesson of dates and numbers. Colonialism requires a story to be built, and about who us was and who was colonizing them, and the entitlement that we have against the other side. In the 1950 Discourse of Colonialism by I.M. Caesar, who was a poet and an intellectual, he states that it had made them linguistically and philosophically into the other. I believe that the reason why Europe committed atrocities in the colonies, it was because it had first succeeded in stripping colonized people of their humanity in the European imagination. Then, in the aftermath of colonialism, whatever happened during that time, whether there was independence or freedom from whatever control, the grammar still remains constant. The logic didn't change. And Frantz Fanon states that after colonialism, the European us changes into the nationalist us. But the thing is, this is the same structure of domination, just with a different face, because us and the usage of us, the meaning of us, will never change. A lot of historians and people use binary distinctions to analyze these us versus them dynamics. What does this look like? This looks like self versus others, center versus periphery, colonized versus the colonizer. And this logic of there being two extremes, nothing in between, this polarization of values reduces the fluidity of moving between categories to a rigid, inaccurate form where people feel forced to identify with one thing and one thing only. And this is a very useful tool, but also it can become a very dangerous cage. We're going to look at this through one historical case study. The reason why I identify with this South Korean history case study is because I grew up in a place called Jeju Island in Korea. And I have met so many relatives, so many people suffering from this case. Because the reason why some of you might not know about this is because it has been erased through historical amnesia. April 3rd, 1948, Jeju Island, Korea. To explain the historical context behind this, in the late 1940s in Korea, it was characterized by political polarization and with Cold War tensions ongoing. People were categorized every single day into opposing ideological camps, and they were identified by affiliations, not by their morals, not by their personalities, not by their names, but just political status. Then in April 3rd, 1948, there was a left-wing uprising against the US-backed government of South Korea. 1 in 10 island residents were killed. In pure numbers, that's 30,000 people on a small island, smaller than like South Korea, which is already small. There were burned villages, people and families were executed, mass murdered, children were killed because guilt of becoming a communist sympathizer also runs in the bloodline according to the government. Then, this whole thing was erased. Families could not grieve openly, because to grieve was the same thing as identifying with the wrong side of the conflict, basically seen as communist sympathizers. And this could make them arrested, tortured, killed. And these consequences made silence. Silence in this case was a mean of preserving boundaries by avoiding its interrogation and the situation. What did this actually look like? Let's look at, let's say, a 7-year-old guy. Your father could have been killed and exterminated by these people. You know that he's gone. People around you, your family, all are aware of the situation, and yet they can't say a thing. They can't even cry or mourn, and that was how desperate the situation was. And this is what happens when us in itself is weaponized at a state level, because us, or the government, was okay and thought it was okay killing them. And it shows that the power of us divides the living, but also governs the dead and what happens to them. In 2003, finally, there was a government apology. A truth commission was made by the president Roh Moo-hyun, and there was victims' closure. But not necessarily, the victims were not triumphant. This is an actual survivor testimony of this elderly woman who lost everything. Her father, her 2 brothers, her home, and she says she spent her whole life not being allowed to cry. And afterwards, when the Truth Commission was made in 2003, she described the feeling as, it gave her the right to mourn, which is the human basic right that everyone should have. But let's look at the right to mourn and what that means. When we think of mourning for someone, when we think of grief, we never see it as something political. We see it as something personal, something emotional. However, mourning is a political act in this case, and it always has been. This is the same thing as when Antigone defied Creon to bury her brother, and Sophocles says, the claim of the dead to be recognized as belonging to someone, and the claim of the living to a grief that is not shameful. In this case, the central paradox lies within this. Us can unite, they form communities and cohesion within society. But at the same time, us has so many detrimental consequences that needs to be eradicated from society. This not only creates polarizations and divisions within society, but when there is a power dynamic between us and them, it leads to large-scale conflicts and war and everything that we have seen that could end in so much violence that is justified through, oh, us versus them, they are communist sympathizers, and etc. And this is not just specific to Korea. It's to Guatemala, Cambodia, Bosnia, Argentina, Indonesia, and beyond. It's applicant for all societies that have experienced polarization. In the status quo, we see the US, the UK, everything being governed by extremes and two parties. And it's the specific us and them, who belongs in us, that changes. But the grammar of their being on us is always the same. Wait, at this point you might say, isn't this human nature? You want to identify yourself with a certain group of people, us and them is natural. Isn't this hardwired tribalism? To some extent, yes. Research at Harvard University does show that there is a difference in your brain reactions to in-group versus out-group suffering. It says that your empathy circuits light up more brightly when you see a suffering of an in-group person comparatively to an out-group person. And you can see this as an evolutionary term, a feature of the human brain. So the question that we have to actually ask is, why do we let the us and the them harden in the first place? I'm not telling you that us should be abolished, because that is naive and impossible, and where there are positive benefits of using us in society. What I'm saying is that it requires a shift of application. We should treat us as a provisional. Why? Because when us as a definition is fixed, when it's only a certain group of people and it excludes others, boundaries go unexamined, identity becomes exclusionary, and the wall between us and them hardens because there's no room for flexibility. However, when us is used as a provisional term, not only is society open to reflection about these boundaries, but also it's subject to inquiry and there's capable of expansion. This is Appia. And he says that we already live in an interconnected society, and the attempt to purify us into something clean is not only futile, but dangerous. He says that the purity project always requires a purge. It always requires a them. So let me leave you with this. In 1948, a line was drawn. Not a geographical one where you can just draw it on a map and say, oh, this is my line, but a grammatical one. On one side, us, and the other side, them. And because of that one line, because of that two-letter word that was wielded by fearful men who thought that certainty was definitely power. On a small island, 30,000 people died, 55 years of silence, and a woman finally allowed to mourn after a half a decade. The problem with us is not the word in itself. The problem is the wall that society into the 2026, but also before we build when we say it. And the problem is that that wall always has one door, and we decide who gets the key to actually break down that barrier. Every generation is handed the same technology, a circle to draw a boundary, and the power to draw it. But however, history does not remember the people who drew the walls in the first place and made the boundary. It remembers the people who opened the doors and broke down that boundary. Questioning us doesn't necessarily eliminate conflict, but it reduces the likelihood of a conflict or any quarrel being judged with scrutiny. That old woman on Jeju waited 55 years for the right, the basic human right to mourn over her father and her whole family. Don't make anyone wait that long. Thank you.